Welcome to Collegial Conversations. I'm Diana Clark, and I'm very excited to talk with Alex Enchin today. He is the founder of Inscape and Accompany, two private advisories that help individuals, families, navigate high quality care across psychedelic medicine, mental health, longevity, relationships, and my specialty, family systems. Inspired by his own personal story, he transitioned from a decade-long career as a tech entrepreneur to focus on advancing innovative approaches to well-being. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Diana.
So I know I spelled that out in a paragraph introducing you, but what I would love to talk about today is primarily your involvement with Inscape and how you came to be more a um, somebody who is interested in providing safe and quality psychedelic medicine care to people in various forms of health. So, love to hear that story. Tell me
Yeah.
what inspired it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you today. I'm from Canada and as you mentioned, worked in technology startups as an entrepreneur for, a decade or so. And I have no formal background in mental health or psychology or medicine. So in many ways, I'm an unlikely person to be on this show. Um, My mom, who has had epilepsy her whole life, about a dozen years ago, started falling, having seizures, which she had her whole life. But she started to fall out of nowhere, and this happened a lot and turned into a lot of head trauma, obviously, like more times than I would care to count. And my parents are divorced, mom is single, and at some point the sort of fear and terror of not being safe in your own body turned into comorbid anxiety and depression, which is understandable. And I went with my mom back in Toronto to lots of different professionals, pharmacologists, therapists, psychiatrists, and just kind of had a passenger seat on navigating the mental health landscape, the conventional mental health landscape. And I was horrified by what I saw. And I actually couldn't believe that, seemingly the only thing that we collectively are doing for people who are struggling, was prescribing things. And, to drill that for a step further, we would wait, a while for an appointment with a psychiatrist. Obviously, Canada is a different system than you have in the US. Wait months or a while for an appointment with a psychiatrist and have a few minute consult and write you a script for some other SSRI and say, come back in 12 weeks.
Right.
And I just couldn't, I'm like, but what about the next 12 weeks? Like, and so the whole system I just found to be like
Tomorrow,
wildly,
what about tomorrow?
yeah, yeah,
About
yeah.
tomorrow.
And the day
Who's
after and the day
caring for
after.
my mother tomorrow? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just found the whole thing to be like mind-bogglingly, inept and unacceptable. And it'll be 9 years in August, we lost a really close family friend, my best friend since like I was a year old. His mother passed away from suicide after a short bout with depression, and I was terrified that this could happen to my mom. His mother, in many ways had like a perfect life and was a very healthy person. My mom had, real challenges, and so I was afraid this could happen to my mom, and that terrified me to be, I mean, which is understandable. And so I was kind of on this quest to see like what can I do to, steer us away from that potential outcome. And I just went looking for like what else is out there and like for people who actually get, relief and get better from these indications, like how do they find it? Where do they find relief? And then hanging out in California, Southern California in 2017, started to notice just a lot of people starting to talk about psychedelic medicine, microdosing and ceremonies of ayahuasca and psilocybin in Mexico or Costa Rica. And there was something I could just sort of feel, I sensed that there's something happening here. And I was really curious, what it was. And I found Michael Pollan's book, sort of, I guess, spring 18. And that book blew me away. I didn't, I knew who Michael Pollan was, but I wasn't familiar with any of his work.
Which book did you read of his?
This is How to Change Your Mind.
Right.
There's also a Netflix, mini series. The book, to me is a masterpiece. The series is good, but I always tell people read the book. Um, and so I just felt reading that book like, wow, like this was like a huge thing in the 50s and 60s, like maybe the most promising thing in psychiatry and psychology back then. And we just don't do this anymore. Like we just got rid of it and
Mhm.
suppressed it and locked it in a basement. That doesn't make sense. And I watched this great film about Cary Grant, the famous actor from back in the day who, had a midlife crisis after,
Maybe.
having
Yes.
a really traumatic childhood in England, and then had this midlife crisis as like the most famous, person in Hollywood, and did over 100 LSD assisted psychotherapy sessions over a number of years, and he said it saved his life. And so I watched this film, and I was like, wow, there's something here. I can kind of feel that there's something here for me that I need to follow. And I felt through reading the book and watching that film, maybe this could help my mom. And like, I think I need to do this too. And I had been, with a therapist for maybe like a year and a half, and for the first time in my life, and like found that to be really, helpful and healthy and supportive for me. And so I said, I want to try this, kind of alternative form of therapy. And so at the end of 2018, I had a psychedelic assisted therapy session with a psychotherapist, and I walked out different. And I could get into how and what, if that's, but I want to let you.
Well, that's a big statement. You walked in Alex Enchin and you walked out Alex Enchin plus. So how were you different?
Yeah, I think that, I tell my story a lot, and I say that, and people are like, okay, like how was your life different? What was life changing? And I think the two things that I would point to are it changed my view of what happens when we die.
Hmm.
I experienced a full ego dissolution, which I had read about in Pollan's book, and was like, that's a really interesting concept. And to me, you can't really conceptually appreciate what it is until you're actually inside of it yourself. And I think, psychedelics are not for everybody, to be clear. I'll probably say that a
We're
few more
gonna
times.
I'll
Yeah.
ask you more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that experience to me was like really healthy for me, which was like a separation from this subjective experience of life, this, sort of first player video game experience of life that we're all in. So like a total disruption, breaking of that, sort of seat of experience, and seeing that there's like a whole other, sort of
Brown.
texture to reality. And so it really changed my view of what happens when you die, when we die. My view now is that our consciousness, our body certainly dies, and that identity, but our consciousness kind of becomes part of the eyes in the sky or heaven or whatever you might want to call it in your belief system. But that was a big one for me. And then the other, which I when I look back, I was 31 at the time. I'll be 39 in 4 weeks. Um, I feel like the version of Alex before that was like almost emotionally autistic in a way. I was very blocked emotionally. Like you could, sort of analogize like pipes that are just, got
Clock.
residue, and yeah, they're kind of clogged, not fully clogged, but like pretty
Narrowed.
pretty blocked. Yeah,
Narrowed.
yeah, very
Narrowed.
narrowed. And the experience and the medicine like really unblocked me emotionally, and I felt this sort of powerful waves of emotion that felt like amplified 100x, versus what you would feel in sort of day-to-day life. And it really kind of like opened the pipes, like a Drano, like a really powerful kind of Drano. And before that, I don't think I was really in touch with what I was feeling emotionally, and I definitely was unable or incapable of expressing Diana, I'm really feeling angry at you because you
Yeah.
started 5 minutes late and don't, I'm obviously making this up, but we started 5 minutes late and like I feel my time is disrespected and I'm feeling angry with you and just unable to like have conversation about my emotional state. And that has, radically shifted for me. Um, and it was also like for me a spiritual experience, and I'm Jewish. That's how it's where I come from. Never really have felt connected to the religious side of it, but more recently, and perhaps starting slowly with that experience, there was a spiritual opening where I felt connected to something bigger than myself, for sure.
How
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
So
And
I was,
I'll say one last thing about that, which was
yeah.
it was clear to me coming out of that experience. I don't really know what this is yet, but like, wow. And I could feel that being inside of this experience where you kind of are like in a zoomed out kind of like you could zoom out on yourself and see yourself from a much more objective lens and compassionate lens, and like could understand like this how the software code of Alex or of Diana was programmed with these early experiences. And I could just feel the potential of this type of treatment to change a lot of people's lives. Like no, I felt this is going to change so many lives, and I don't know what this is yet, but I know I want to help people get access to this in a safe and high level kind of way.
And you did. You did. You went about, your next step was the Costa Rica venture, correct? Was that where you put your energy next?
Yeah, so I felt like I knew I wanted to help people get access to this, and I felt like, all of the suffering that I'd been witnessing of my mom, and the kind of collateral suffering of my grandmother and my aunt and my sister and I, and like as from the work you guys do every day, it's a wide blast radius for these issues, challenges. But I knew I wanted to be involved, but I didn't know how, and so I spent about 2 years talking to people and researching and reading and learning. And I met a guy who worked at a place called Esalen that I
Hmm.
think you and I have talked about
Yeah,
that
yeah,
previously,
yeah.
in Big Sur. And he was wanting to create like a next generation place like Esalen, but more focused on, therapeutic work with plant medicine and psychedelic medicine. And so I met him, and then I felt like, the regulations as we're seeing now, as FDA approval kind of gets closer, and Oregon and Colorado, having sort of citizen-led or like legislative initiatives to legalize this type of therapy. Um, I felt like the place to do this was in North America. It was in, Canada or the US. And he's like, I have this amazing property I've kind of assembled in Costa Rica. And I had been there once when I was like 17, and I was like, oh, it's beautiful, but it's like kind of far. And he said, just come see this place. And I went to see it January of 2021, and it was the most beautiful place I'd ever been. And so I was like, I'm in. And so him and I teamed up, and he had already kind of seeded this like concept called Holos,
Hmm.
which is very much like a tribute to Stan Groff, who
Hmm.
created holotropic breathwork and like an
Definitely.
early
Hmm.
psychedelic researcher, who's now I think about 94 years old, and he was like a
Still alive. I
scholar.
didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a scholar in residence at Esalen for like maybe 13 or 14 years. And anyway, we teamed up, we raised several $1 million from investors, but definitely like impact focused investors.
Hmm.
And we bought this land and then started subdividing a part of it to sell to people who wanted to live in a community with, holistic living, close connection to nature and community, and like an organic farm. So that, covered sort of part of the development. And there's maybe like 8 people who are living there full time now, and a few homes under construction. And then we built this sort of, glamping kind of eco glamping kind of initial retreat center. And that's been operating for, almost 4 years now.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. From vision to a physical plant. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And
So
it was like a raw piece of land, no roads, no power.
I
And
know
so,
Costa Rica. That's
yeah,
raw.
yeah,
That's raw.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Lots of hot. hacking. That
Yeah,
is it,
machete. Yeah,
machete. So we talk about the upside and the real benefits of the potential for psychedelic medicine and plant-based medicines and things like that. Not everybody is a candidate. And what worries me personally as a professional in this field is that the people who aren't candidates don't know they're not candidates and in fact are often the ones seeking it. So
yeah,
how do you sort of tease out who is a candidate for this kind of, I know that you're not the clinician, but you
yeah,
do provide
yeah.
retreats at this point, right, for psychedelic
Yeah,
medicine?
I mean, the majority of what I do is I would call it advisory, for lack of I don't love the word concierge, but some people have said that is I have a small number of, impeccable providers who I trust with my
Mhm.
life, actually. And
Literally, yeah.
yeah, and are just really, really gifted, have a lot of training, a lot of experience in this work. Some are clinical psychologists, some are therapists. One is a Chinese medicine doctor, one is a restoration ecologist by background. And they are people who, professionals who provide what I've seen over, about 8 years now, the highest level of care that I've seen in this field. This field, while it has a lot of promise and I'm like very excited about it, there's also a lot of,
Cowboy.
yeah, cowboy chicanery,
Yeah.
some harm, and a lot of mediocrity, actually, like a lot of mediocrity. And so because of the status of it, and it's, sort of this unregulated, sort of not limbo, but we're like sort of waiting for approval and it to become sort of more regulated and FDA approved. And that's obviously for like treatment of mental health indications. There's
Hmm.
like a whole other, area, which is where I spend most of my time, which is actually the betterment of high functioning people. People that don't have, depression or PTSD or anxiety, but are like, I have a beautiful life. I'm not able to enjoy it, or I'm navigating a divorce, or I'm like drinking too much and I'm smoking. I'd like to give that up, or I'm, struggling with a chronic health issue. And I'm curious if there's like some, other emotional, psychospiritual kind of underpinnings to it that are not like treatable with medication that I'm curious about. I'm looking to explore myself. Or, we work with quite a few post-exit entrepreneurs who have built a business over, many years or decades. Were chasing some outcome, got it, made a ton of money, and then thought that they would be happy and actually find it went the total opposite way and are like kind of in this identity spin, don't really know who they are anymore or what their values are, and are like actually like really struggling. And not a lot of people have compassion for a, entrepreneur who just sold his business for $150 million and,
I
made a,
agree.
yeah. But like, there are unique problems to that world. And, I know you guys at Intent Clinical, work with a lot of wealthy families and, a lot of people are like, what do you have to be sad or depressed about? Your
There
dad's
is
broke.
nothing emptier than
Yeah.
a completed quest that didn't fulfill.
Mm,
That's a very empty
yeah.
sense. And I could see why they would be drawn to, I am empty. What I was chasing
Yeah.
worked during the chase, perhaps, but not on the achievement.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what that would be a draw. I could see
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And I want to make sure I answer your question because it was a good one. But, you know, this work and most of like what, when someone has real, PTSD or major substance abuse,
Hmm.
I direct them to resources that are best in class around, that type
Treatment.
of treatment. But, I mean, just so I'm clear, the question was like, who is a fit for
Who
this?
is not a
Who
candidate?
is not a candidate?
Yeah.
So, people with um, certain health, conditions, people who are on certain medications obviously would be excluded, not entirely, but definitely like a lot of psychiatric medications,
Mhm.
SSRIs, MAOIs, would exclude, certain things like
Yeah.
MDMA and ayahuasca and 5-MeO DMT. Certain things that we're finding like originally, I think at Hopkins, which is, the leading institute for
Yeah.
research in the world around psychedelics, used to be that people who are on SSRIs could not participate in the trials, but that has changed for the
Mhm.
psilocybin. They're finding that psilocybin is actually safe with those drugs, but it can dampen, the experience or mute the experience a bit. Um, Narcissistic personality disorder, psychedelics don't tend to work very well
Really
on narcissists. They can actually like go the other way and amplify.
interesting. They
Um,
can amplify the grandiosity.
yeah, and definitely, people who have close, sort of immediate family members with schizophrenia or certain, psychiatric, challenges like that would be, if not exclusionary, definitely like a real narrowing of what is safe and appropriate. And I think, the way that I think about it, and a lot of the people that I'm close with in this field, like there's the safety question, and which is very important, and then there's the appropriateness question of like, is this actually a good idea? Is this person ready? The
Two
readiness,
questions,
like,
right?
yeah, like, is this person ready? It may be medically safe, but if someone is not ready to do this, it can go pretty bad.
Right.
There is real, most of the risks are psychological, but like these things are really, really powerful
Powerful.
substances. And like one thing that I really disagree with of a lot of the people, or not a lot of, but many people sort of in and around this field is like, I don't think that this should be ever treated like cannabis. I don't think these medicines should ever be sold in like a dispensary.
Mm-mm.
I don't think microdosing will ever be, to like my opinion, I just think these things belong in, and I'm actually like pro consenting and healthy adults using, certain drugs
Sure.
recreationally and stuff.
Sure.
But these things are really powerful, and like people couldn't jump off buildings and run into traffic and, think that they can fly and stuff. So like I'm an advocate for and supporter of like psychedelic assisted therapy, supervised, intentional,
Love that.
therapeutic, and I just want to make that clear. Yeah.
That's great. Have you had experience with somebody who's had a bad trip or a bad experience, and how did that sort of guide your thinking throughout your development of what you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim Ferriss, the author and podcast host, who's one of the sort of more prominent philanthropists in this field, and I think one of the really interesting things along the last 8 years that I've been, interested and involved in this work has been there was no federal research money available because these drugs have been Scheduled One for a long
Right.
time, which means no medical value, scientific value, highly, highly illegal. And so the government could not fund research. So all of the research that has been happening, up until pretty recently has been funded by private donors, including a handful of, billionaires that, have had experiences and really had, really impactful, beautiful kind of life trajectory altering experiences. And Tim Ferriss is one of them. And he, has this great line about bad trip and good trip, or good trip, bad trip is like not really the right sort of
Okay.
frame to think about it. And he said the right way to think about it is safe and unsafe trip.
Right.
And I really like that. And I agree with that because, in my experience, having difficult content, whether that's, trauma with a capital T or a lowercase t, but whatever the difficult stuff coming up in the experience, being able to actually be with what's arising and to be supported by like really, really impeccable, guide, therapist, facilitator, et cetera, is where a lot of the therapeutic benefit comes from. And
Totally.
so, I've been present for more than a couple people who have had sexual abuse in their, early years in childhood. And that content coming up in one of these sessions is not going to be enjoyable, obviously. It's horrific. I'm shocked through being in this field, like how common sexual abuse is in our world and in North America, frightening. But being with that experience and those memories is not going to be fun at all. It's going to be probably very, very difficult and heavy, but being able to be with what's coming up and feeling really, really well supported is where a lot of the therapeutic benefit comes from.
I
And
get it.
so, pardon me?
That in and of itself would be healing.
Yeah, yeah,
I
that
can
is,
experience and be safe at the same time. That would
yes,
be
yeah,
healing. Yeah.
yeah. And to have an empathetic witness
Mm-hmm.
to that process and to, to like just feel like
Mm-hmm.
you have the support at your back to be able to like be with
Yeah.
what's there. So so I do love that. And I think, that yeah, the number one thing people say is I don't want to have a bad trip.
Mhm.
And
That's from the 60s. I'm sorry.
yeah, yeah.
I
And I
would,
think,
yeah.
I wasn't around back then, but I think that, one of the reasons psychedelics went the direction they did was that they were being used widely in culture without any guardrails or any wisdom
Oh,
from
no.
elders. The way that they're used in indigenous communities is in ceremony with
Ceremony.
elders and wise, people around that really like understand how to hold these very, very big experiences. And I have seen what happens when this doesn't go well. I have seen someone have a psychotic episode from I won't I will say that it was catalyzed by a psychedelic experience. This
Here we go.
person was in very rough shape going into it. Their set and setting was not, in a great
Mm.
spot. It was a bit of a Hail Mary attempt. So I have seen what happens when it doesn't go well, and it's very scary and challenging. And I think that was a really important part of my education in this field. That was 6 years ago, 7 years ago. But really important for me to see that this doesn't always work and it can go wrong. And just, to really hold this work and these compounds with a lot of reverence and a lot of humility because they're very, very powerful. And these are not like SSRIs or, other drugs, other medications. There's something different about them.
I love that. We have spent our allotted half an hour now, and I could go on for 2 more hours and pummel you with questions.
Yeah.
But since I'm not allowed, tell me
Yeah.
what would be one thing you would want to finish this conversation with? What would you like the audience to know?
Yeah, great question. I think that, I'm always astounded by how many people, um, smart, successful people end up doing this work not in a great way.
Mhm.
Go to some, sort of underground person on a referral from someone who doesn't really know anything about this work. And like, what we do is like, very small and sort of unscalable, you know, but I really love to help people avoid mistakes in this area and get access to like really, really high caliber resources. And, I think that these things are coming. They will be integrated into psychiatric clinics. I think at some point into like wellness hospitality, which is something I've been really, passionate about. And I'm
Yeah.
starting to talk to a couple, sort of like higher end,
Mhm.
medical spa longevity businesses and hotels about how to incorporate this in a non-clinical way or in a less clinical way. But I think, what I would want to just end on is that these things have like incredible potential to help people connect with who they really are. I've seen them, save marriages and relationships. I've seen people, experience in, a day or two what 10 or 20 years of psychotherapy may or may not touch. And this is not a shortcut. This is always, in my view, must be paired with either therapy, coaching, and psychological support alongside other sort of lifestyle, interventions like taking care of yourself, functional medicine, exercise, sleep, adequate nutrition and healthy relationships and boundaries and communication. But I think the last thing that I'll say, Diana, is that to me, what I think a lot of people miss about this field is like, I had a call yesterday with a friend's wife who's like, I want to do this and I would love your advice and guidance and like what psychedelic and I think that it's not like the psychedelic is for sure a huge, huge part of this, but to me, it's the relationship. And I think most people think that this is like, going to the spa or going to the dentist and getting your teeth clean. Like it really, really, really matters who you do this with.
Who you're on the journey with.
Who is your guide? Who is your therapist? And like that you have a deep rapport and like an unlimited, well, not unlimited, but like a really deep level of trust because this work is intimacy. And so a lot of what I do, when people kind of come into my field is like get to know somebody over a couple conversations and then say, Diana, after really meeting you and getting to know you and understanding your family system and your work life and just, your health journey, I think that this therapist and you would like really vibe, and I'd love to introduce you and you to get to know her or him and to like see if that's a fit. And so that's how I come at this, is like it's about the relationship first. The medicine happens in the context of this relationship. And so I think that's a great place to end. And I'm
I love
excited.
that approach. Thank
Yeah,
you, Alex
yeah,
Enchin.
yeah.
And for you listeners slash watchers, if you like this episode, please like us at Intent Clinical. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diana.